The little girl stood in the open doorway of the diner, snow swirling behind her like a curtain the wind had torn loose. She couldn't have been older than 4. Pink coat too thin for December, snow boots crusted with ice, red curls spilling from beneath a knitted cap, cheeks so cold they'd gone the color of winter roses. Nobody moved. The whole diner just stopped. Forks halfway to mouths, coffee cups held midair, conversations dying in throats. And then Rex stood up. The German shepherd didn't wait for a command, didn't look at Jack, just rose quietly from beside the booth and walked toward her, slowly, deliberately, the way he used to move through buildings overseas when something needed finding. He stopped directly in front of her tiny boots and lowered himself to the floor. The little girl looked down at him with wide, watery blue eyes. Then, for just a moment, the fear on her face softened. A small, trembling smile, gone almost as fast as it came. She looked up, found Jack's eyes across the diner, and whispered words that would change everything. "Sir, I can't wake up my mommy." Welcome back to Jack and Rex Tales, where the stories are simple, the people are real, and the moments that matter most often arrive when you least expect them. Jack Thompson was 45 years old and had spent 15 years doing things most people would never fully understand. Afghanistan, Fallujah, deployments that blurred into each other like one long sleepless night. Teammates buried in folded flag ceremonies while their young wives stood too straight, trying not to collapse in front of the cameras. He'd come home with a limp in his right leg and a silence inside him that no one knew how to reach. After retirement, he bought a small house on the edge of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, and opened a modest auto repair garage on Route 9. He kept to himself, nodded politely at neighbors, answered questions with the shortest words available. Most evenings, he drove home to an empty house, heated something from a can, and sat in the same chair by the window until sleep finally took him. And most nights, sleep brought the war right back. The only thing that helped was Rex. The shepherd had served beside him overseas for 4 years, had pulled Jack from a collapsed building during their final deployment, dug through rubble with bleeding paws until rescuers followed the sound of his barking. The doctors told Jack later that another 20 minutes and it would have been too late. Rex had given him those 20 minutes. So when Jack retired, Rex retired with him. They understood each other without language. Rex knew when the nightmares were coming before Jack's eyes even opened, would press his warm body against Jack's side in the dark without being asked, would stay there, breathing slow and steady until the shaking stopped. That was their life. Quiet, predictable, safe in the way that lonely things are safe. That Tuesday evening in December, Jack had driven to Miller's Diner around 9 o'clock simply because the refrigerator was empty and the walls of his house had started feeling too close. Snow was falling steadily outside Millbrook. Christmas lights glowed from old porches along Main Street. Somewhere up the hill, the Presbyterian church bells rang the hour. He'd slid into his usual booth near the window. Rex settled beside him automatically. The waitress, Carol, set down his coffee without being asked. "You okay tonight, Jack?" "Just tired." He stared through the frost-edged glass while the snow thickened beneath the streetlights. Thought about nothing in particular. Thought about everything at once. The way a man does when he's been alone too long and the quiet has started talking back. Then Rex's ears went forward. The shepherd's whole posture changed in an instant. That particular alertness Jack recognized from 1,000 dark hallways overseas. Not aggression, recognition. Like he'd already decided something before his mind caught up. Then The bell above the door rang, and the little girl walked in from the snow. Jack was crouching in front of her before the diner found its voice again. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophie." "Okay, Sophie. Where's your mommy right now?" "At home." Her chin trembled. "She fell down by the couch and she won't wake up. I tried to make her wake up, but she won't." Fresh tears spilled over. "I shook her arm a really long time." Jack's chest tightened hard. "Did you call for help?" She shook her head. "I don't know how." 4 years old, alone in a snowstorm, had walked however far it took to find someone, anyone, because her mother needed help, and she was the only one there to get it. Jack was already reaching for his coat. "Show me where you live." He looked back once at Carol. "Call an ambulance, now." Outside, snow drove sideways across the parking lot. Jack lifted Sophie into the passenger seat of his old Ford pickup. Rex moved without being asked, pressed himself against her small, shaking body, warming her the way he'd warmed Jack through 100 bad nights. Sophie looked down at the shepherd, then wrapped both arms around his neck and buried her face in his fur. Jack drove. The neighborhood Sophie directed him to sat near the edge of town, where the houses leaned with age and porch lights burned weakly against the dark. A small duplex with peeling white paint and a plastic wreath on the door. Inside, the cold hit him first. Then the details came fast the way they always did. Combat-trained eyes sweeping a room without choosing to. Empty soup cans in the sink. A stack of past-due envelopes on the counter. Children's crayon drawings taped carefully to the refrigerator. A small artificial Christmas tree in the corner, missing half its lights. A paper star taped crookedly to the top. And, beside the couch, on the floor, a woman. Unconscious, barely 30, dark hair across her face. Jack moved. Pulse weak and thready, skin burning with fever, breathing too shallow and too slow. "Sophie, there's a blanket on the couch. Bring it to me." Her little hand shook as she pulled it free. Jack covered the woman carefully and stayed with her, monitoring her breathing until the red and white lights of the ambulance flooded through the front window. The paramedics worked fast. One of them checked her glucose levels and spoke quietly to his partner. Diabetic, severe hypoglycemic shock. Jack stood back and let them work. Sophie reached up silently and found his hand. He looked down at her. She was staring at her mother with an expression no 4-year-old should have to wear. He didn't let go of her hand. At the hospital, fluorescent lights buzzed in long, pale rows above exhausted hallways. Sophie sat curled in a waiting room's chair, with Rex pressed against her legs, one small fist buried in the fur of his neck. Jack sat across from them, elbows on his knees, watching. Something about the sight of them together moved through him in a way he couldn't name. Like a window opening in a house that had been sealed shut for years. A social worker appeared around midnight. Clipboard. Careful voice. Rebecca Carter, she explained, was a single mother, worked nights at a nursing home outside town, had lost her insurance coverage when her hours were reduced 3 months earlier, had been rationing her insulin since October, stretching doses, skipping days, trying to make it last until she could afford more. Jack said nothing for a long moment. Then the social worker mentioned temporary foster placement, and Sophie heard the word, and the panic on her face was immediate and total. "No!" She grabbed Rex. The shepherd stood at once, planting himself between the child and the room. Jack placed a calm hand on Rex's neck, then looked at the social worker. "She stays with me tonight." "Sir, that's not standard procedure." "I know." His voice was quiet, steady, the voice of a man accustomed to making decisions in difficult rooms. I also know that little girl walked through a snowstorm alone tonight to save her mother. She's scared and exhausted, and I'm not putting her somewhere strange in the middle of the night." He held the woman's gaze. "She stays with me." A long pause. The social worker looked at Sophie, still pressed against Rex, eyes red from crying. She signed the emergency approval. They were allowed into Rebecca's room near 2 in the morning. She looked fragile against the white hospital pillow. Tubes running from both arms, eyes heavy with exhaustion and medication. But the moment she saw Sophie, she broke. "Oh, baby! Oh, my baby!" Sophie climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed and pressed herself into her mother's arms. "I got help, Mommy. I found him." Rebecca looked over her daughter's red curls toward the doorway where Jack and Rex stood quietly. Jack watched the emotions move across her face. Confusion, gratitude, and then something else. The particular shame of a proud person who had fought hard and still needed saving. The look of someone who wanted desperately to say thank you, but couldn't find words large enough. "You saved my little girl," she said finally, her voice barely holding. Jack shook his head once. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "She saved you." Rebecca pressed her face into Sophie's hair and wept. That night, Jack brought Sophie home. His house sat back from the road near the tree line, small and warm from the fireplace he'd started on the drive back. Military photographs lined one shelf. A folded American flag rested in a glass case on the mantel. Rex's old K9 service vest hung beside the front door, the patches still sharp after all these years. Sophie stood in front of it. He was a soldier too? Yes. Was he brave? Jack looked at Rex, who had already claimed his spot on the rug near the fire. The bravest one I ever knew. Sophie walked over slowly and wrapped both arms around the shepherd's neck. Rex closed his eyes. His tail moved once, slow and content. Jack turned toward the kitchen before Sophie could see what had risen in his face. He made grilled cheese sandwiches. Sophie sat at the kitchen counter swinging her legs, watching him work with serious eyes. "You got kids?" she asked. He paused for just a moment. No. She considered this with the gravity only small children bring to obvious conclusions. "You should." He kept his back to her and focused on the pan until the feeling passed. Later, long after Sophie had been tucked in with every blanket Jack owned, he found her sitting in the hallway on the floor, blanket around her shoulders, stuffed rabbit in her lap, eyes too wide for sleep. "I miss my mommy." Rex came from nowhere and laid down beside her without a word from Jack. The shepherd's warm bulk settled against her small body like he'd been doing it for years. Jack lowered himself slowly to the floor across from them, back against the wall, the way he used to sit in hallways overseas when the night was too loud to sleep. "When I was away at war," he said quietly, "and the nights got hard, Rex used to sleep beside me too." She thought about that. Then she scooted herself in her blanket across the floor until she was beside him, leaned her small shoulder against his arm. "You don't gotta be scared tonight," she said softly. Jack Thompson had survived explosions, had carried wounded men through gunfire, had stood at more grave sites than he could count without his jaw tightening. But those 6 words from a 4-year-old in a dark hallway came closer to undoing him than any of it. He didn't speak, just sat there in the quiet while Rex breathed steadily beside Sophie and the fire crackled softly at the end of the hall. And for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, he didn't feel alone. Weeks passed, then months. Rebecca recovered. Jack quietly helped fix the heating in the duplex. Rebecca, who turned out to have a sharp, organized mind and no patience for disorder, started handling the books in front office at Jack's garage 2 afternoons a week. Sophie spent those afternoons doing drawings at the desk beside Rex, who had appointed himself her official shadow and took the responsibility seriously. The house changed. Crayons on the table, small shoes by the door, the particular kind of noise a home makes when a child lives in it. Not loud, just alive. Cartoons on weekend mornings, laughter that echoed off walls that had only ever held silence. One night, a nightmare woke Jack hard, the kind that left him sitting upright in the dark with his heart hammering and the smell of smoke still somehow in the air. Rex was already beside him, pressing close. Then, small feet on the hardwood. Sophie appeared in the doorway, half asleep, rabbit tucked under her arm. She didn't ask what was wrong, didn't need to. She just walked over, climbed up next to Rex, and placed her tiny hand over Jack's. "It was just a dream," she murmured, already drifting back to sleep. "We're right here." Jack looked at the ceiling for a long time after that. Then the tears came, quiet, slow, the kind a man cries when something he'd stopped believing in turns out to still be true. He didn't wipe them away. He just let them fall. One December evening, almost exactly a year after that snowy night at the diner, Jack sat in a folding chair in the gymnasium of Sophie's elementary school. A hand-painted banner across the stage read, "Annual Winter Recital." Children in mismatched costumes shuffled toward crooked microphones, while parents held up phones with cracked screens. Sophie stood center stage in cardboard angel wings that kept sliding off her left shoulder. When she spotted Jack in the third row, her whole face ignited. She waved both arms like she was flagging down a rescue helicopter. The audience laughed softly. Beside him, Rebecca shook her head and smiled through wet eyes. After the recital, walking to the truck through fresh snow, Sophie reached up and took one of Jack's hands and one of Rebecca's, swinging between them across the parking lot. Later, driving home through glowing Millbrook streets with Sophie in the back seat talking non-stop about her performance, and Rex's head in her lap, and Rebecca leaning quietly against the window, Jack thought about what the drive home used to feel like. The silence, the dark windows, the weight of a house waiting empty. He stopped at a red light. "Jack?" Sophie said from the back seat. "Yes, sweetheart. Remember the night I found you?" He looked at her in the rearview mirror, at Rex, at Rebecca. Snow drifted slowly beneath the streetlights outside, and something settled inside his chest, warm and permanent, the way healed things feel different from unbroken ones. "No, kiddo," he said gently. "That was the night you and Rex saved me." This story carries something important beneath its warmth. It speaks honestly about the invisible wounds veterans carry home from war, not just physical injuries, but the deep isolation that follows men and women who have survived things they cannot fully explain to the people around them. It reminds older viewers that loneliness is not weakness, and that healing rarely arrives the way we expect it to. It speaks to the quiet crisis happening in too many American homes. Single parents rationing medication, skipping doses, making impossible choices between bills and survival because the safety net has too many holes. Rebecca's story is not fiction for millions of families, and this story treats it with the dignity it deserves. It shows the extraordinary courage of children who often act with a purity and bravery that adults have learned to be afraid of. Sophie did not hesitate. She walked through a snowstorm alone because someone she loved needed help. That instinct to move toward the person who is suffering is something worth holding on to at any age. And it shows what animals, especially working dogs, give to the people they serve. Rex did not need to be told what Sophie needed. He simply knew. That bond between a veteran and his canine is real, documented, and profound, and this story honors it without exaggerating it. Most of all, this story is about the families we build from the broken pieces life leaves behind. Not the families we planned, the ones that find us anyway, on a snowy Tuesday night, in a diner, when a little girl walks through the door and changes everything.